This is an interview with Alex Rakotz of 200 Old Broadway. It's done for the Hastings Historical Society. Today is July 2nd, 1993. My name is Evelyn Drewes. Alex, where were you born?
I was born in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York.
And where in Hastings?
98 Railroad Avenue.
What was your father's name?
My father's name was Gabriel. My mother's name was Stefanida Schleuder.
What kind of name is that?
Russian.
How did they happen to get to Hastings?
Well, I guess things were hard in Russia, and they lived in around the Minsk area, I guess. And I really don't know the reason they came, but they're here.
Did you ever, were you in touch with any of your Russian relatives?
My father was. I guess his brother and her brother, my mother's brother.
Did any of them come to the U.S.?
Not that I know of. I don't think we really have any relatives here in the United States.
Just one.
Not that I know of.
Just one Rakotz who arrived.
I believe so.
No cousins or
Not
anybody
that I know
who came?
of. No.
And tell me about how many children in your family?
My oldest sister is Ann Kissel of Hastings, Mary LaFarise of Connecticut, Helen Rakotz of Hastings, Sophie Karschmidt of Hastings, who is deceased, and John Rakotz of Ardsley.
How did your father support that big family?
When he first came here, I guess he worked for the railroad a while. And then he finally went to Yonkers to the Hampshire Wire and Cable Company, and he worked there.
How did he get back and forth to work in Yonkers?
At the beginning, I think it was probably bus, train, and then later on it got to be where the younger men that worked there had cars. And it was car transportation.
Yeah. You had a second thought about how your father got to work.
Yes, it probably was trolley. The trolley cars going at that time. Probably, I think he walked to City Line and took a trolley. I'm not sure whether trolleys were operating through the Hastings or not. I don't think so, not at that time. I believe it was trolley. He would walk and then trolley, or train.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the car, like I said before, when the young men started to work there.
Tell me what it was like growing up in Hastings. Was there anything for kids to do that was interesting to young boys?
Growing up in Hastings at that time was a pleasure. We had a good time. There was no comparison with the kids today and the times we had as children.
But you didn't have much money.
The money wasn't there, but the facilities were there. I would call them facilities because they were. We had the river. We had the Hastings Plaza, which was used for recreational purposes and weekends when there were no cars there. And even before that, there weren't that many cars, commuters going to New York, as far as that goes.
Did
They
the
would mostly walk
plaza?
down.
Did the plaza have parking meters there?
Oh, no parking meters.
Yeah.
And the
So it
plaza
just
was made through the Hastings Pavement Company blocks.
So it was wide open for
It
you
was
to
wide
play.
open. I could explain it. It was in three sections. One was along where the old Scott's garages were. Then there was a middle, the road that went up toward the sugar pond. And then the other one was close to the station. And it had two islands in the middle, separating the three divisions. And the whole circular section of it was wide open where you could roller skate, ride bicycles. We would use one section for a game we called Prisoner's Base. A lot of activities. The recreational department used it as a sprinkler system in the summertime to cool off the kids. We had the ball field between the bridge and the plaza.
Mm-hmm.
It was rough, but it was still a ball field, and we played baseball on it, football.
Did the mothers take their little kids down there for the sprinklers?
They were mostly the ones that would use it. The older children would be down at the river, sunning and swimming. Then we had the Ravine Park.
Tell me about Sugar Pond before you get away from the plaza.
Sugar Pond, to me, is Sugar Pond, and it is
Under the
today,
bridge.
even with the Newington Foundation being there. By the way, they made a beautiful job.
Yeah.
And the Sugar Pond up by Hillside is not Sugar Pond. I think at one time it was called Three Islands.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I remember one year the Sugar Pond was low. It was just plain mud and very low in water. And I remember we got up one morning and we went out to the Sugar Pond, and it was loaded with carp, about 1.5 to pretty near 1 to 1.5 feet long.
Mm-hmm.
And it was loaded. And people were going in and picking the carp out and taking them home. We swam in it once in a while, but we had a little fear of it for swimming purposes. I think at one time it was called Sugar Pond. I'm not positive, because there was a sugar factory there. And I think it burned down at the time. Well, I think that's why it was called Sugar Pond.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, the Hastings Pavement Company used it to get their water for cooling off system at the plant. I'm not positive of that either, but I believe that's what it was, because there was a pumping station right at the pond itself, right beside the flume that came down. And then we had Ravine Park, had recreational facilities up there. It's a beautiful little park with the stream, brook, stream, call it whatever you want, running
Okay,
alongside.
now locate Ravine Park.
It's just east of the bridge. It's where the Newington Foundation has their facilities now.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Ravine Park. And we were surprised when the village took it away from us and made it into the DPW, the Public Works Department.
Tell me about the activity on the river with you kids.
Well, that was most and best. We swam, we fished, we crabbed.
Did you eat everything you caught?
Not really. We would take quite a bit home to be used by the families. But we would, especially the crabs, we would catch them and sell them to the taxi drivers or whoever wanted them for 60 cents a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you caught some soft shell crabs out there or something like that, you would sell them for a little more, of course, a delicacy. Then we would take trips across the river to what we call the Guinea Gardens, the Palisades. It was a beautiful little spot. We were chased occasionally from
That's what I was going to ask you.
a caretaker or whatever. But we would always come back, and I guess he must have got tired of chasing us, so never bothered us too much.
Was that one private estate, Alex?
It was part of a private estate that was up on top of the Palisades, or halfway. They had a mansion up there. I remember that.
You don't know who lived there at the
No,
time?
I don't. No, I don't. But the place was beautiful. It had a small pool that was fed by cold water coming off the Palisade.
You didn't swim across the river. You did have a boat to go across.
Oh, we took a boat, but a lot of us swam across there. But we wouldn't swim across by just going across alone. That would be stupidity.
Yeah.
No, we went over in boats, kayaks, rowboats. I remember one time going across the river in a cement mixer. You know what a cement mixer is?
No.
Like a trough, a metal one.
Yeah.
That they used to.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
All
yeah.
right, maybe that deep.
Yeah, I had visions as the big round
Oh, no.
Yeah, okay, now I know what you mean.
Hand mix.
Yeah.
Put boards
Yeah.
across, we would paddle across and back. And then finally one time we went across, we were about halfway home, and the water was starting to get rough in the river. And the water got in, and there was metal, and it sunk. So we had to swim the rest of the way to Hastings.
How did you account for losing your cement mixer?
Oh, that was gone. That's in the middle of the river. Goodbye, good luck.
Right.
But talking about the Guinea Gardens, it had the pool, it had beautiful gardens. I don't know whether they were Italian or Greek colonnades that supported grapevines and flowering vines and so on and so
Wisteria
forth.
or something or
with
other.
a patio of,
Yeah.
what was it?
So they didn't want to be invaded by all of you kids.
Well, I guess they got tired of chasing us, so they didn't bother us too much. No, it was beautiful. We enjoyed it. We'd go quite a bit.
Yeah. Tell me about your first association with the Fraser family.
Well, I came back from service. I worked in the Anaconda for a while. They laid me off, and I heard about a job at the Frasers as a, well, I guess you'd call it a labor, call it whatever you want. It was still taking care of the estate. And I got the job, but I figured it was temporary. So I waited until the Anaconda called me. And they called me back, and by that time I was married. I got married in 1948 to Marguerite de Clark.
De Clark is an old name in Hastings, too.
Oh yes, it goes back quite a ways.
Where did Peg's family live in Hastings?
Peggy's family lived on, when I met her, they lived on Warburton Avenue. I forgot the address, number. But her grandfather owned quite a bit of property up on Washington Avenue, along here. And I believe at one time he owned one of the Lafergie houses over on Five Corners.
What did he
church is
do, Alex, that he could buy real estate?
Well, I remember old Doc Todd used to talk about him coming from really
Money.
didn't know where,
Oh, okay.
but he came to Hastings with money. So evidently Doc Todd probably figured he was a black sheep of the family somewhere coming to Hastings.
Interesting.
You can erase that. I wouldn't want that.
Peg won't care.
But the
And
money
her-
was there, and
Yeah.
he must have come from a very affluent family.
Yeah.
And we know that there are cemetery sites over in Nyack, in Rockland County, that have a lot of de
De
Clarks.
Clarks.
As a matter of fact, Florence Katzenstein, you remember her? They have a place over there. She told us that there was a cemetery over there loaded with de Clarks.
De Clarks.
Yeah. So that's probably maybe where he come from.
Yeah.
Now, I couldn't be positive of that.
And Peg's mother.
Peg's mother was Barbara Bolarowski. They had a place up on off of Division Street. I forgot the name of the street. It was a dead end. They came from there.
What was their background?
Hungarian.
Hungarian.
They were Hungarian.
So your kids ended up being Russian Hungarian.
Oh yeah, beautiful mixture.
Yeah,
And
nice
figure
mixture.
de Clark, either Irish, English, French.
Right, yeah. Both of your parents were Russian.
Yes, they were.
Yeah, right. Well, it made three very nice kids. Your kids are Barbara.
Barbara, James, and Stephanie.
And Stephanie was named for her grandmother?
Stephanie was named for her grandmother and grandfather, Stephanie Gabrielle.
Right.
My son James was for his grandfather, James de Clark. And of course, Alex Rakotz.
Of course, the grandson.
Right.
The grandson,
And
of course.
Barbara was named after her grandmother, Barbara Bolarowski, and of course her father, Alexis.
Of course, right.
Yeah,
Right.
and keeps going.
Yeah,
And my grandson is named Alex James Rakotz.
right. Got that taken
Oh, I had to
care
get
of.
that in.
Right,
Of course.
okay. Now, go back to the Frasers, your first introduction to the Frasers.
Well, I would like to say I was hired, and I figured it was temporary. The Anaconda called me back, and by that time I was married, and I needed a job. We lived on Washington Avenue, right up above here. And then I talked to Peggy. Peggy said, well, do whatever you want to do. Do you want to go back? Are you happy with Anaconda? Happy where you're working now? And I was happy.
But you had a union at Anaconda.
We had a union.
That was a kind of protection, wasn't it?
Yes, it was kind of a protection for, and I would be making more money, of course. But she said, are you happy where you're working now, or would you be happy in the Anaconda? I said, I wouldn't be happy in the Anaconda, and I was very happy. Well, she said, stay there.
Sure.
Who knows what will come of it. And she was a prophet.
So how many years were you with the Frasers altogether, do you remember?
31.
31 years.
31 years.
It started what year again?
1948, I was hired. I'm not sure whether it was 5 or 6 years after that James Morton died, the superintendent. Colonel Fraser came down to me and said, would you take over? And I said, well, at the time I said, I'm not sure if I'm capable. He said, you're capable. So I said, fine. So he said, when Mortons move out, which became plenty of time to settle their affairs.
Where did the Mortons live?
They lived on 123 High Street. It was a big house. It was a nice house.
I think some people have sometimes mistaken it for a carriage house. It never was.
Never was a
carriage house.
No, never was. The house we live in now at 200 Old Broadway was considered the carriage house. 123 High Street was used for the superintendents. I can't say that now. See, if you go back far enough, I remember James Morton, or Mr. Morton, telling me about a Dunbar, another Scotsman. I guess they always hired Scotsmen until it came to me. And he took over after Dunbar, but Dunbar lived in my house. Now, I don't know if that house at 123 High Street was built at that time, before Dunbar. So maybe it was built later. And that's where, when I was employed, that's where James Morton lived. When he died and Morton family moved out, I moved in. And I took over the estate. It's a beautiful estate.
Yeah. What were your jobs, Alec?
What do you mean, what were my jobs?
I'm taking care of getting things done on the estate.
Oh, everything. Everything in husbandry. Landscaping, gardening. We had an extensive garden. Plenty of vegetables.
Which is your love.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was just a beautiful place. We had about 75 apple trees. We had a small peach orchard, quince, pears, currants, grapes. We had an asparagus patch of about 50 feet by 50 feet. I never liked asparagus until I got there, tried them out, and then we ate them every day when they were in season, of course.
Yeah.
Grapes, we had a hothouse grapes, about 7 or 8 vines and one green, like a greenhouse. And they were exotic grapes. They were wonderful. When they were in season, we used to cut them. The colonel would take them down to his friends. We would pack them in 2-quart boxes and wrap them up. We would take them down to his associates down there.
In New York?
In New York. They loved it.
Tell me about the where he worked in New York, or the mansion in New York. Did you get down to?
Well, it wasn't a mansion. It was a large apartment. It was at 850 Park Avenue. It had a lot of rooms. I can't think of how many rooms there were. And it was big. It took up 1 floor of the complex. I went down there often to take them down, bring them back and forth. And they would stay there in the wintertime. That was their winter retreat, if you want to put it that way. And they'd come back once in a while to Hastings during the winter time, maybe weekends. That's what this conservatory up there was, the greenhouse that was attached to the house.
Were you there when that was attached?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
I took care of that. This is
Yeah.
where I would have it set up where she would have cut flowers whenever she wanted. In the summertime, of course, the cut flowers from outside. In the wintertime, they came from the conservatory.
Mm-hmm.
And when she came up, she had her cut flowers to cut
Mm-hmm.
and bring it in the house to her vases.
Mm-hmm. How many children were there in the
There were
Colonel
four
Fraser's?
children.
Yeah.
Sarah, George C. III, Dorothy, and Thomas Tuck.
And they're all still living?
You
Are
mean-
those Fraser children all still living?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Now, there were 4 generations who lived in this mansion. Thomas Fraser, who lived there first
He originated the
The-
estate. I believe he had the house built, but I'm not positive of that.
in 1855.
That would
Love
be
it.
it, right.
Mhm. And he lived there with his 2 sisters.
Well, he was married. He had a wife.
Hmm. And did they all? You think they all lived in that house together?
I believe they might have, but
Yeah.
I couldn't be positive of that. Somebody would probably have to give you more information on that than I would.
Miss Jenny and Miss
Miss
Grace.
Jenny and Miss Grace.
Well, we know about Miss Jenny and Miss Grace because they were very generous with the Reformed Church, gave money during all the hard times to keep that going.
Mm-hmm.
We also know about that first Thomas Fraser because of the Fraser Free School, which was named for him. So that generation of the Frasers must have been very active in the community.
He was, because I believe, I don't know if they had mayors at the time. I don't know if first, second, or third president or mayor of Hastings, but at the time he was. He was interested in the educational process in Hastings that you already know, and that's where the Fraser Free School came from.
Do you think he was friends with anybody in the neighborhood?
I really don't know.
Yeah. Was it then his son, Thomas Fraser, had...
No, he had no son.
Oh, but you told me he was married, but no children.
No children.
Okay, well, where did George
When
Corning Fraser?
I don't know where George Corning Fraser came from,
Yeah.
but he was a nephew of Jenny and Grace,
Mm-hmm.
and he inherited the estate.
Mm-hmm.
That was George Corning Fraser Sr.,
Mm-hmm.
well, the first.
But he was not the son of Thomas. Thomas
No.
was married but with no children.
No children.
Miss Jenny and
Grace were his sisters.
And they were not married.
Right.
They were unmarried.
Right.
Okay. Then from George Corning Fraser Sr. came...
George Corning Fraser Jr.
All right. Now, George had a sister.
Anne Fraser Brewer.
And where did she live?
She lived in a mansion on Warren Street,
Yeah.
the brick Georgian.
But who was that house built for, Alex?
George Fraser Jr. built it in around the Depression era, about 1929. He built it for himself and his family, and his father lived in the regular
In
mansion,
Lovett.
which was
Mhm.
Lovett.
Mhm.
Well, Lovett was the whole estate.
Yeah.
And then when George Fraser Sr. died, George C. Fraser Jr. moved into the mansion.
From the Warren Street.
Right, and then Mrs. Brewer, Anne Fraser Brewer, moved into the brick Georgian.
Hmm. And there was another sister in that
Yes,
family
there's
also?
Sarah Robbins, and she lived up in Massachusetts in around Ipswich, I believe it was.
Then we come to the generation that you worked for.
Well, that was the kids, most of the kids were gone by then.
Mm-hmm.
The only ones that were around, Sarah, I forgot her name, her last name. This is why I'll get the information from Tom Fraser.
Okay.
And he'll give me the family tree, the
Okay.
whole thing, and can have it. They lived up in, because they,
But let's just get their names, Alex.
Sarah, I can't remember her last name.
Okay. And then there's
Then there was George C. Fraser III.
And
Then there was Dorothy Shore
Mm-hmm.
and Thomas Tutt Fraser.
Mm-hmm.
That
Right.
was the 4 children from George C. Fraser Jr.
Tell me about George C. Fraser Jr.'s wife. You have some history about her.
Yes, I gave you the history on her, you can read.
Mm-hmm.
Her name was Sylvester Moran,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe she originated from New Jersey, over in Mendon, New Jersey, just outside of Morristown. I remember going over there quite a bit. They maintained residence over there. They had a big family house over there.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, that's where they cook came from, that they brought over to Hastings.
Did they have much, did they employ many people from Hastings in the mansion?
You mean in Hastings?
In the mansion, mm-hmm.
Not really. Anybody they can really get to work there. I think at one time the Ramseys worked there, and the Hogans. I remember the Hogans worked there.
Ted Hogan told me about having
Right.
worked there, and his wife was a cook.
I remember that. That's
there.
right. They worked. I forgot about
Yeah.
that, but
Yeah.
now that story comes back. And I believe, I don't know which Ramsey worked there, and Hallinan. Now the house next to where we live was actually a superintendent's cottage of the old Longview place. And he used to work, but he lived there. And then the Colonel Fraser bought that out, and so he owned the property. And the only piece of property that
was the Haynes's house. That was the only,
that was the only
yeah,
piece of property
property.
that didn't go around
Yeah.
the whole perimeter of High Street.
I'm surprised he
Broadway.
didn't buy
If
that.
he wanted to, they wouldn't sell it to him.
I see. But he did have a mortgage on the inn across the street.
Oh, on Longview.
Longview.
Oh, yes, he had a mortgage on it. He owned it after a while.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what I understand.
Yeah.
And he sold it to Mrs. Benedict of the Certain Foundation.
Yeah.
You can erase that and I'll tell you a story.
When did the Frasers move away from Hastings, Alex?
I couldn't tell you the exact year, but I think we were in, I could tell you the exact year if I check on to when we bought the house.
All right.
1956, that may be pretty close.
Was that when they sold it to the developer?
Developer, right,
Yeah.
Park Knowles.
Yeah. And were you around at the time that all those houses were being built?
Yes, we bought the house on 200 Old Broadway from the developer. That had to be about 1956, you're right.
That's when it was sold to the developer. Then he shortly moved out of the mansion.
Yes, lock, stock, and barrel. We went over to the town of Greenburgh, which has a Hastings address, adjacent to the St. Andrews Golf Club. What's his name, the steel magnate?
Carnegie.
It was the Carnegie House, Carnegie's retreat, his golf retreat. And people by the name of Weld owned it at the time. And I forgot, I think it was maybe about 10 acres of land, mostly wooded, with the house sitting in the middle of it, the house of maybe about 15 rooms. It was a real Dutch colonial house.
Just he and Mrs. Fraser at
Just
that
he
time.
and Mrs. Fraser moved there, right.
Do you recall what kind of furniture they took from the mansion?
Oh, yeah. It's real old stuff. A lot of Queen Anne. As a
Did
matter
the
of-
children take a lot of furniture out of the house?
When a time came, yes, because there was so much furniture in the house that
There
it
were-
wouldn't fit in
There were
the house
20,
they
20
moved
rooms in the mansion.
Is it 20?
There were 20 rooms in the
I
mansion,
don't
so
remember
that,
how many rooms. I didn't count them. But,
how did they decide what was going to be taken by the children?
I really don't know. They just came and took whatever they wanted, I guess.
Yeah.
They had a lot of stuff appraised by appraisers coming in, a lot of art stuff that was just stashed away at different places. We got an old clock from it, an old Seth Thomas. When they moved, we got the pitcher and bowl. We got a few articles that Mrs. Fraser parted with and said, by all means, Al, you can have it.
Uh-huh.
By the way, she was a wonderful woman.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen pictures of her. Was she a charming lady or what?
Mrs. Fraser was a beautiful woman.
Mhm.
She was a lady.
Mhm.
A lady in every sense of the word.
Mhm.
Very gracious. Level.
Mhm.
Very seldom she would get her dander up,
Mhm.
even though one time I got my dander up and she said, oh, Al, please.
What would cause you to get?
Oh, I forgot what it was.
Yeah.
I had a pretty good temper.
Uh-huh.
And that's the way she was.
Yeah. Do you know anything about her background? Did she come from the same type Scott background that the Frasers
I
had
think it
come
was
from?
an Irish background, but
Yeah.
I'm not. I gave
Yeah.
you a booklet on it you can read.
Yeah.
I think it's open. She come from New Jersey and around Mendham, which is just outside of Morristown. Her father, as I understand it, was a big-time engineer, and I guess he had a lot to do with building of the George Washington Bridge.
Mhm.
That's as far as I know.
Mhm.
She had a brother that lived in the house we live in now at 200 Old Broadway.
What was his name?
His name was Moran, I think Daniel Moran.
Mhm.
That's about all I know of him.
Was there any church affiliation that you knew about?
What's that?
Church affiliation?
There was a church up in well, I guess they must have had something to do with the Dutch Reformed Church at the beginning.
Some of the older
The older
Frasers
ones, and I'm not
had.
sure if it was George Corning Fraser. It was the other, not the one I
older-
worked for.
The older ones.
But they, I know Mrs. Fraser and Mrs. Brewer went up to a church, St. Joseph's of Arimathea,
Mhm.
up in Ellsford.
Mhm.
That was their
Yeah.
affiliations. That's,
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, that's where Colonel Fraser and Mrs. Fraser were buried out of,
Mhm.
the church.
Do you know if there is any community, did they take part in anything in the community? Did they shop in the village, or did they have friends in the village?
There was one friend he had, his name was Skank. He lived in River Glen Apartments, the houses down there. That's about all I know of. They had friends up in Ardsley Park and Irvington and so on. That I remember. And New York City, of course. That's about it.
Did they have a lot of guests that came out from the city, or?
Oh yeah, they entertained.
Mhm.
They entertained.
Right. Do you know if they considered tearing the mansion down when the developer bought that property?
No, if I remember correctly, the developer wanted to keep it up because he thought it would be less expensive for him to put a piece of land around the house and sell it as a whole.
mansion.
And that went with the red brick up on Warren Street, the same way. he left that and left a good piece of land, but that was,
Did the developer buy the mansion on Warren Street also?
he bought the whole place.
He bought all of it.
Everything was bought by him.
Mm-hmm.
That, with the exception of where the Paynes live today.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot the people who owned it previous to that.
But when the developer sold the mansion, did he sell the mansion or rent it?
No, he sold to both mansions.
Yeah,
They didn't rent it.
I see.
They sold
And
it.
he sold, do you know the people he sold the mansion to, Lovett to first?
People by the name of Siegel.
Yeah.
And then I guess the Siegel sold it to the whoever
Carlson's.
lives there,
Yeah.
Carlson's.
Hmm. Do you know who bought the one on Warren Street?
I think he still lives there.
Young.
Young.
Was he the first one to buy it?
I think so.
I remember somebody rented that house before, but I think it was when the Frasers owned it.
I don't think they ever rented it out.
Can't remember their names right now, but there was, they rented it like a two-family house.
Let's put it this way. I'm not sure if they rented it, but I know
Two families lived there at one time, I
Right.
remember.
Mrs. Brewer moved out,
Okay.
and one of her children, by name of Davenport,
Mm-hmm.
a daughter with their tribe, lived in part of the house,
Mm-hmm.
and one of her old friends from college lived in the other part of the house.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot their names, probably Peggy would remember.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if they rented it. I don't know if they
Yeah,
just came to
yeah,
live there, because I'm
Well,
not positive on that.
The developer was anxious
Had
to
nothing to do
sell.
with that.
Yeah, he was.
The developer sold it to
Yeah,
Young.
right. Yeah, and Young is still there.
Young is still there,
Mm-hmm.
and the Siegels are not, and the Carlsons are.
Yeah, the Carlsons have been there for a long time also.
Quite a number of years.
Yeah. I remember the mansion had two furnaces.
No, it didn't.
I went down in the cellar of that mansion. Mrs. Carlson had a music teacher living there. And the cellar of that mansion was like the catacombs. We took a trunk down there. And, well, then was one furnace to heat the greenhouse, or what was the...
No. One furnace heated the greenhouse, I believe so. One furnace, I'd have to see it again.
Okay, that's the
It's been so
reason
long
I-
ago, we had
Yeah.
a big furnace for the house.
Yeah.
It had an offshoot of hot water flowing to the greenhouse when we needed it.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a hot water heater in the corner. A large circular one.
Mm-hmm.
That was for the hot water. But I only remember one furnace.
Mm-hmm.
One large furnace.
Yeah, maybe I'm mistaken. Somebody...
You may be right. You know, it's been so long, I don't remember we had two furnaces or not.
Mm-hmm.
We might have.
Well, the developer did take out chandeliers and things of that sort out of the mansion, so that people, I think, did think that they had planned to tear the mansion down. But you never heard any thing about that.
No. But the
Yeah.
only thing, like I say, it was worthwhile for the developer to sell it separately.
Mm-hmm.
It would have cost them a lot of money to tear it
To
down.
tear it down. Mm-hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
the way he went.
Mm-hmm.
And they subdivided the land around the two mansions. But they kept the other houses on. They kept the one at
Yeah.
I Street,
Yeah.
and they kept the one which they sold to me,
Mm-hmm.
and even the old Howland house,
Yeah.
which they bought from developer too
Mm-hmm.
at the time. Yes, they bought it from developer.
Mhm.
I thought maybe they bought it from Fraser, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Fraser gave it to them, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
And that's the way it went.
Yeah. So, how long did, tell me, was Colonel Fraser honorary colonel or an honest-to-goodness colonel?
No, he was a true colonel in the Air Force.
Do you know
He
what his
operated
job was?
Yeah, he ran an air base at Dakar in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
and that's where he was a colonel.
When they moved out of Hastings, how long did he live after that time? Do you remember?
Oh, gee.
He died a number of years before Mrs. Fraser.
I'm starting to think 31.
Did they still maintain their house in the city? Their apartment in the city?
After a while, they sold 850 Park Avenue. And then they bought a condo, I think, it might have been a condo, on 63rd Street in New York City. And that was their New York apartment. Smaller.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
what they needed for the two of them.
How long did the colonel go into New York for business?
Quite a while, until he couldn't do it anymore. Then he started to get where he could. His walking was.
Yeah. Did somebody in the family take over the business?
You mean after that? I think it was George, and George operated out of Texas. They had large holdings down there. Had to do with oil and land holdings where they leased our land to cattle, oil, and so on. I remember at the time they formed a Texas oil and land. They called it TXL. And I guess George III operated out of Texas, and Thomas Tuck operated out of an office in New York.
Were the son-in-laws involved in running the business?
Not that I know of. I couldn't be positive, but I don't think so. Mr. Shaw had a lot to do with the state of New York, environmental planning.
That
so
was
on.
Dorothy's husband?
That's Dorothy's husband. Right.
Yeah. Was he an attorney, or do you know?
Gee, I don't know. I don't think so, but he could have been.
Yeah, yeah.
He could have been.
And what happened with, you were trying to remember how long Mr. and Mrs. Fraser, Colonel and Mrs. Fraser lived after they moved out of Hastings.
I'll try, like, it was about 5 years I worked for James Morton or the Frasers. Maybe less, I'm not positive. I'd approximate about 10 years in Hastings on the estate.
Yeah.
And then we moved, and like you say, what was it? When did they sell it?
1956.
1956?
That's when they sold it to the developer.
1948, that's about 8 years, right? 8 years, that's 8 years I was in Hastings, right. Okay, about 1956 to 1979 is what? 23 years?
23 years.
Right, that's about right. I'd say 1956, maybe about 15 years. And about that time the Colonel died. And then Mrs. Fraser stayed on until 1979.
Did she have somebody live with her in that big house?
Well, she had her help. She had a cook, and she had a woman. At that time, when the Colonel was sick, before he died, they had a woman taking care of him. And then a little later on, a woman died, and they had a male nurse to take care of him.
Tell me about Colonel George Fraser's personality. Was he a typical colonel, or?
You're talking about me thinking about him personally.
Yeah.
He loved life.
Yeah.
He played.
Was there a little Scotch liquor?
He loved the bagpipes. Of course, St. Andrews Golf Club. Most of the people at the time were very affluent people, wealthy, Scotch, most of them. They'd always